Roger Altman is one of more than 60 business leaders and former government officials who sent a letter to congressional leaders and members of the super committee urging more than $1.5 trillion in budget cuts. Now, that's a current mandate for the super committee. And Roger, who's also chairman of Evercore Partners Investment Bank and a former deputy secretary of the U.S. Treasury, joins us now. Roger, welcome to Street Smart. Good to have you here. It sounds like you're pretty much in line with the sobering words that came out of Doug Elmendorf yesterday, head of CBO. What needs to be done, or what needs to be told to the American public at this point?
Well, the point of view of those of us who signed that letter is that the right thing to do now is not a partial solution, which 1.2 trillion or 1.5 trillion would be, but rather a once and for all solution, which would be, generally speaking, in the neighborhood of 4 trillion over 10 years. But at the same time, as so many objective people in this debate have said, let's do one final round of stimulus, as President Obama and many others have proposed, and then a year to two from now, let this once and for all deficit and debt solution kick in, so that you allow the economy to get itself onto a better footing now, and in a position, as Doug Elmendorf alluded to yesterday, to better absorb the contractionary impacts of debt and deficit reduction. But once they do kick in, let's have a plan in place that deals with it once and for all, which fundamentally means stabilizing the debt to GDP relationship in the United States.
Roger, let me ask you, I mean, we here at Bloomberg and a majority of Americans don't believe that this final round of stimulus, $447 billion job bill, is going to actually help lower the unemployment rate. And I have to say also, the economists that we've spoken to don't believe it's going to help. The equity fund managers we've spoken to don't believe it's going to help. The debt fund managers we've spoken to don't believe it's going to help. Pretty much everybody has said enough with these short-term solutions, enough with these temporary tax cuts, enough with everything that's temporary. What we need is long-term certainty, stability, to be able to see out so businesses know what they're dealing with 3 years out, 5 years out. How do you respond to that? What do you think about it?
Well, first, with all due respect to those you just cited, I don't agree with that point of view. First, I believe that the stimulus of 2009 and 2010 was effective, even though that means it prevented our economic situation essentially from getting worse, especially from an employment point of view. And second, I do think that the plan the president put forward, or other plans similar to it, his isn't the only one that would make sense, would have a positive impact on growth and jobs. Now, despite the opinions you mentioned, there have been many others, like Moody's Analytics, like macroeconomic advisors, like Goldman Sachs, for example, all of whose economics departments have projected that the plan would actually add substantially to growth and to jobs. Roughly speaking, up to 2 points of growth as compared to a scenario where no stimulus at all is extended, and up to almost 2 million jobs under the same assumptions. So there is a great debate about this. It's an important debate. It's a healthy debate. I just don't happen to agree with the point of view you mentioned.
But to cut the deficit by the magnitude you're suggesting, right? And I want to quote from Doug Elmendorf's testimony yesterday. He says citizens will either have to pay more for their government, accept less in government services and benefits, or both. So it seems like there's some difficult medicine, some unsavory medicine that the American public has yet to swallow. And no doubt a number of politicians don't really want to address the reality.
Well, I'm glad that you quoted Doug that way, because that's the essence of the matter. But of course, what he said is fundamental and well known by every objective person, and by the way, well known by almost all members of Congress on either side of the aisle, even though some of them won't come forth and say so publicly. We have a deficit which is more than $1 trillion a year at the current annual rate, and depending on your economic forecast, 8 to 9% of GDP. Now, the only way to close that deficit is either A, entirely on the spending side, B, entirely on the revenue side, or C, a mix of both. And the deficit's so big that whichever way of those three you choose, there's going to be a lot of pain. either the revenue increases are going to be substantial, higher taxes,
and well, let's
or the
talk
spending
about the
cuts.
Specific pain, though, right? Because when it comes to spending, it's really about entitlements. You know, you can have short-term stimulus programs.
Not entirely. Remember the super committee, which met for the first time yesterday, and before which Doug Elmendorf was testifying, and it has to report out its recommendations within about 3 weeks. If it fails to agree, then there will be $1 trillion of automatic cuts in the discretionary account, not entitlements, half on the non-defense side and half on the defense side. But that entire $1.2 trillion of automatic cuts, if they can't agree, will be out of the discretionary account over 10 years, not the entitlement account. Now, the right thing to do, as your question suggests, is when it comes to spending reductions to reduce the rate of growth in entitlements. Everybody knows we have to do that, although it's a very tricky assignment, and also to make certain cuts on the discretionary side. So it should be a mix of revenue and cuts, and the cuts should be effectively across all the major accounts in the government.
What do you do, though, Roger, about the big problem in Washington, which seems to be that they really can't agree? I mean, you know, our poll found that 62% of the people in this country don't approve of the president's handling of the economy. His jobs approval rating is 45% right now, which is low. But when you drill down, you find out the real concern is just that Washington doesn't get along. And it seems like the president is the one going in the direction of compromise. So how do you deal with that problem of partisanship, of not being able to get things done? Or how should he?
Well, there's no getting around the problem as you describe it. We're at a low point in cooperation and effectiveness in Washington, although we've seen many low points in American history. It's not new. But you're right about that. The poll, however, and I saw your poll and read it carefully, I think is a little bit ambiguous in the following sense. I think what Americans are primarily reflecting there is their anguish over economic conditions themselves. The fall off now in growth, obviously 9.1% unemployment, and so forth. Extraordinarily difficult and anguishing circumstances. And so when they say they don't believe the plan, I don't think they would believe any plan at this point, because they're really discouraged about the economy, which, by the way, itself is a problem because it causes consumers and others, you know, to restrain themselves. But in my judgment, as I said, I do think one final round of stimulus makes sense. I do believe it would be effective. I think part of this proposal the president has made will be enacted, particularly the payroll tax cuts. I think Republicans ultimately will support those, probably both on the employee side, which we've already had for this past year, so we're extending it another year, and on the employer side, or some version of the employer side, as the president has proposed. I think that probably will pass, and that's a little more than half of the whole plan. So I don't think we should be completely black and pessimistic about the chances of any of this going forward, because I suspect that part of it will.
He's shifting the focus now from U.S. to Europe. There may be some signs of hope for the European credit crisis. We've been talking about it throughout the day. French President Nicolas Sarkozy and German Chancellor Angela Merkel said today they are convinced Greece will remain a member of the Euro Monetary Union after they spoke with Greek Prime Minister George Papandreou. And a report citing a Chinese bank official suggests China would be a willing buyer of European debt. Roger, I want to get your thoughts. First of all, we spoke about this in the commercial break. It's a little bit ironic that Treasury Secretary Geithner is over in Europe telling them how to fix their crisis when we're still dealing sort of with the aftermath and repercussions of our own.
That's one way to look at it, but I take a little different perspective. I think history is going to show that the United States reacted forcefully, in a big way, and effectively to the disastrous credit market collapse of late 2008. And I think history is going to show that Europe reacted more slowly, in smaller ways, and I think so far less effectively than we did. So in this one regard, how we dealt with the financial side of our crisis as compared to the growth and jobs crisis we were just talking about a minute ago, I think we did pretty well, and I don't think that our credibility is all that low in Europe, and that Secretary Geithner is going there and otherwise leaning on the Europeans that way is not inappropriate.
Yeah, you know, Roger, I thought it was interesting today. Mark Dow who used to work at the IMF and has also worked here in public service, asked somebody, hey, do you think Tim Geithner now should get credit for, because, you know, if you look at what's going on in Europe, it sort of looks like he actually did quite a good job handling the financial crisis, along with Ben Bernanke and the other people who were, and Henry Paulson, the other people who were dealing with it at the time. Do you think looking at Europe makes us look good? Do our banks, for example, look really healthy when you look at European banks? Yes.
Comparatively speaking, we do look good. Our banking system deleveraged relatively quickly through a combination of capital raising, asset sales, and so forth, and now is in relatively good shape. Not perfect, perhaps, but good shape. The European banking system, as we all know, is much more leveraged. It took less of those actions I just described than our system did, and is a lot shakier. So no matter what perspective you apply, I think the U.S. did a good job on the financial side of crisis response. I don't think Europe has done as well.
Roger, so on the fate of Greece and the rest of the euro region, markets once again calmed today by some of the announcements coming out of the conference call between Merkel, Sarkozy, and Papandreou, of course. But we've seen this. This is not the first act of this particular play, if you will.
Well, that's right. And it's heartening to see the equity markets here sharply higher today, and better also yesterday. But 1.5 days doesn't make a long-term trend. And the European crisis is at a very delicate stage and a complex stage. I do agree with the statements today to the effect that Greece will not ultimately break off from the Eurozone. And otherwise, my own view is the Eurozone is going to remain intact. But the immediate questions, will Greece comply with the austerity program which it agreed to in exchange for another direct infusion from the European Financial Stability Fund, and in exchange for the exchange offer which was agreed to? That remains unclear, as well as how ultimately the long-term necessity, which is that having agreed on a single currency, they have to move to a single balance sheet and a single credit, and ultimately have to move to a single fiscal entity, maybe just an enforcement mechanism over the 17 different countries, but a common fiscal entity. How they will get from here to there, that's very complex. So this crisis by no means is over. And we could see, unfortunately, a day or two from now, markets back in a teetering negative position because we've been seeing this back and forth for quite a while now.
Do we see some sort of, Roger, soft restructuring? I mean, they've got to do it in a way that avoids the definition of a default, right? Because that's not allowed if you want to remain a country in the EMU, not to mention the fact that it would set off the swaps.
Well, remember that an exchange offer, or restructuring, depending on your favorite term, was agreed roughly 4 or 5 weeks ago in exchange for, as I said, the austerity program and the additional direct infusion from the EFSF to Greece. And that exchange offer involves, for example, some of the short-term note holders, like the 2-year debt holders, exchanging that debt for higher rate but 30-year debt. Classic exchange offer type of approach. So that is in the works, but it requires that the Greeks hit the targets on reducing the budget deficit and the pace of those reductions. And right now that's in question because they're off target. So that restructuring is on the table. The point is, can the Greeks live up to their end of the bargain?
Well, what about the German or French voters say, Roger? Because, you know, Angela Merkel can say all she wants in a statement of solidarity with Sarkozy and Papandreou, but if she gets voted out, it's going to be a problem. And at some point, you know, I spent a lot of time in Germany. At some point, the German voters have had enough of paying for the problems of Greece and Italy.
Well, that question, which is a very good one, illustrates the extraordinarily fine line that Chancellor Merkel and other European leaders, but especially she, have to walk. Because on the one hand, as I just said, there's no ultimate choice but between moving towards a single balance sheet and moving towards a fiscal union. But that, at the same time, is deeply unpopular in Germany, as you say. So she's in a very, very delicate position. She's very wily, she's very smart, and I certainly hope she retains her grip on authority. If she were to lose it, that would be a huge setback for the stability of the Eurozone. Huge.
Roger, assuming all things stay the same at this point, stabilizes, and austerity measures throughout the region, which we've heard about, Italy, Spain, a number of countries aside from Greece are trying to put in place a number of austerity measures. But will those economies actually be able to thrive? Unemployment rates are so extraordinarily high in Greece, in Spain, through Italy. What happens after all of this?
Well, first, over the very short term, austerity means more weakness. Because literally the austerity we're talking about, for example, in Greece, involves substantial public sector layoffs. So by definition, job losses. And by the way, it also involves tax increases, substantial ones. So very short term, austerity programs like these do bring on additional weakness. But they're a little bit like bankruptcy in the corporate world, where initially there's tremendous pain and it's applied almost to every constituent. But it has, if things go well, the long-term impact, like we saw with General Motors and Chrysler, of being a huge cleanser, which then positions them to do better and better in the long run than they would otherwise do without it. So it's equivalent of short-term pain and, you hope, medium and longer-term gain. But it requires that everybody play their part.
Right. The best case scenario certainly could sort of hit the reset button, but certainly crisis not over there in that region. Thanks so much, Roger. Do appreciate your insights, staying with us here on Street Smart for so long today. It was Roger Altman, chairman of Evercore Partners and former deputy secretary of the U.S. Treasury.